They sentenced him in silence. No tears, no arguments. No one dared defend him. When Machiavelli lost everything, his rank, his title, his future, he did not plead. He did not panic. He just stared forward, still as stone, as if nothing had changed. But something had. Not in the court, not in the city, but in him. While others rushed to reclaim reputation, he vanished into the shadows. And there, stripped of power, he discovered something far greater. The mind that does not flinch is the one that rules all things. It is always the calm one who scares you. Not because he is loud, not because he is strong, but because you cannot read him. You cannot break someone who does not react. That was Machiavelli. In every room of ambition, there was always noise boasting, threats, alliances shifting like sand. But in the corner sat the quiet man, watching, measuring. Most assumed he lacked confidence, that he was timid, small, soft-spoken. But that silence was his fortress. While others exposed their thoughts like open wounds, he kept his guarded. Not even the most dangerous men in Florence could tell what he would do next, and that made them uneasy. You see, stillness is not weakness, it is a strategy, a trap. When others rush to speak, they reveal their motives. When they panic, they telegraph their next move. But the one who stays still, who does not blink, forces the world to guess. And every time they guess wrong, he gains ground. This is what makes a mind unshakable. Not that it never feels fear, but that it never shows it. Not that it lacks emotion, but that it refuses to be ruled by it. In Exile, when most would have collapsed, Machiavelli sharpened this weapon even more. They thought they had broken him. What they did was remove the distractions. And in that isolation, he became something far more dangerous than a politician. He became a philosopher of power. He studied men the way generals study terrain. He mapped their insecurities, their desperation, their need to be seen and heard. And then he did the opposite. He vanished. He said less. He worried less. And the less he worried, the more he saw. Because panic narrows vision, stillness expands it. And when your mind is calm in a storm, it feels like you control the weather. Machiavelli didn't need armies to conquer. He only needed one thing, a mind that no one else could reach. Not with threats, not with insults, not even with loss. That was his secret. The moment you stop worrying, you start winning. Quietly, completely, without mercy. Most people think panic is harmless. That it's just a temporary crack in the mind, something you ride through, something you survive. But Machiavelli saw it differently. Panic is not a phase. It's a weapon. And if you're not the one using it, you are the one bleeding from it. He understood something the rest of the world refused to admit. Worry does not stay in the mind. It leaks into your voice, your posture, your decisions. You may believe you are hiding it, but your enemy can smell it like smoke. Panic is what makes powerful men overstep. It makes kings rush into traps. It makes rulers second-guess their orders and generals delay their strikes. It is the root of hesitation, and hesitation is the first sign of defeat. That's why Machiavelli never taught leaders to times avoid, times fear. He taught them to times control, times it in others. Let them drown in their own dread. Let them imagine betrayals where none exist. Let them react too soon, too loud, too desperately. That is how you rule without raising your voice. But you cannot pull those strings if you are tangled in your own. That is the part most fail to grasp. You cannot manufacture fear in others if you are consumed by it yourself. This is why Machiavelli saw calm as a higher form of cruelty. Not the cruelty that wounds, but the cruelty that exposes, because nothing humiliates the fearful more than standing beside someone who does not flinch. Worry makes you small. It collapses your posture. It bends your decisions around invisible threats. But a still mind, the kind that does not tremble when provoked, creates a contrast so sharp it becomes a mirror. Your panic reflects. Their calm reflects. And suddenly the room knows who holds power, even if no words are spoken. Machiavelli never begged, not even when they tortured him, not even when they dragged him into the shadows of power and left him there to rot. Because the one who begs admits defeat before the war begins, so he waited, he observed, he let the others burn themselves alive in their own doubt. And when they fell silent, when the room emptied, when the crowns shifted again, he returned not with vengeance, but with vision. Worry steals vision. That was the lesson. It makes you miss the opening, because you're too busy guarding the wound. It turns strategy into survival. And no one builds an empire in survival mode. Machiavelli knew that better than anyone. That is why, in every moment of collapse, he kept one hand steady, not clenched, not trembling, just still, because panic may be loud, but power, real power, is always quiet. There is a kind of man who cannot be rattled, not because he is fearless, but because he has separated fear from function. Machiavelli built that kind of mind, not with affirmations or illusions, but with dissection. He took his thoughts apart like a surgeon. He stripped them of their drama. He wanted to see what remained when you remove the noise. Because that is where power lives, in what remains after panic. Most people never get there. They believe every emotion must be obeyed. If they feel it, it must be true. If they worry, it must be a warning. But Machiavelli knew that the mind is not a prophet, it is a battlefield. Every thought competes, every emotion fights for control, and only one can win. He chose clarity. While others surrendered to the first wave of fear, he waited for it to pass, and when it did, he made his move. The architecture of his mind was built around delay, wait, observe, act, never the other way around. And it made him dangerous, because once you stop reacting, you start noticing. You see the tells, the weak spots, the shift in tone. You see how even the confident ones are performing. You see who they flinch for, who they secretly serve. And most of all, you see how easy they are to move, once you understand what they fear. That is the anatomy of a quiet mind, not an empty one, a weaponized one. Every thought sharpened, every emotion interrogated. He did not suppress feeling. He questioned it. What is this fear trying to protect? What is it distracting me from? What would I see if I didn't feel this right now? These were not the thoughts of a coward. These were the rituals of a tactician. And when you do that long enough, your default state becomes untouchable. You don't absorb chaos, you convert it. And the men who once sought to provoke you find themselves unnerved. Because nothing scares the manipulator more than the one who does not respond. They throw the bait, and it sinks. They light the match, and you don't burn. Eventually, they exhaust themselves trying, and you remain clear-eyed, unbroken, thinking. That is how empires are controlled, not by force, but by the few who refuse to be pushed, the ones who sit at the edge of the fire and do not sweat. Machiavelli became that man, not by luck, not by nature, but by architecture. He tore down the fragile mind and built a fortress in its place. And from that fortress, he studied the world not as a victim, not as a servant, but as something colder, something calculating. And in that cold, he found peace. Because once you master your mind, no one else can use it against you. When the city turned its back on him, when the walls of power slammed shut, and when his name was erased from every corridor he once walked, Machiavelli did not scream. He picked up his pen, while the others whispered of his disgrace and debated how long he would last in exile. He sat alone and wrote as if nothing had been taken. But something had been taken. Everything, in fact. Status, income, honor. And yet, this is when his power truly began. Most men, stripped of their place in the world, unravel. They cling to what they were, beg for a second chance, and lose themselves in the storm of humiliation. But Machiavelli treated it differently. He treated collapse as a subject to study, not an end and opening. He took long walks in silence. He studied the rise and fall of empires like they were chess moves. He examined how Caesar crossed the Rubicon, how Hannibal failed in the end, how Florence devoured its own sons. His pain became data, his ruin became a reference. This is where the average man breaks. But the unshakable mind begins to build, because when everything falls, most people panic and react. But Machiavelli slowed down. He refused to mourn what had been lost. He replaced loss with leverage. He didn't grieve the city that exiled him. He mapped it, from memory, from history, from the behavior of its rulers. And in doing so, he saw it clearer than he ever had when he was in the center of it. Distance is a weapon when you know how to use it. Exile gave him something the palace never could: perspective. And perspective turns tragedy into control. Most rulers only understand power while they have it. Machiavelli understood it better after it was gone. He dissected every mistake, not just his own, but those of men who died with crowns on their heads and daggers in their backs. He learned more in silence than most learn in command. And while the city forgot him, he remembered everything. No bitterness, no delusion, just patterns, names, tendencies. He did not plan revenge. He planned understanding, and that understanding became his legacy. That is the thing no one sees. Collapse, for the right mind, is not the end. It is the clearest mirror. It shows you who you are without the costume, without the praise, without the role. Most men look and shatter, but Machiavelli looked and rebuilt. And what he built was not a new version of his old self. It was something colder, sharper, more permanent. A man who does not beg, a mind that does not bend, a presence that cannot be erased, even when he's gone. Because when the world collapses and you take notes instead of shelter, you come back not as a survivor, but as something they never see coming. They expected him to be bitter, to rant, to chase the men who betrayed him. But Machiavelli did none of that. He did not relive his downfall like a victim stuck in the past. He rewrote it like a strategist documenting a battle. Because while most men use memory to hurt themselves, he used it to sharpen his perception. He did not sit in exile, remembering how it felt. He studied what it meant. Every decision, every hesitation, every misstep, it became a lesson. He removed the emotion like a surgeon removes decay. Not because he was numb, but because he wanted clarity more than comfort. That's what separated him. He thought like a historian, not like a wounded man. Pain wasn't his prison, it was his archive. The betrayal of friends, the collapse of Florence, the public disgrace, he treated them all as chapters in a larger pattern, a pattern of human behavior. Because history, to him, wasn't just stories. It was strategy in disguise. He saw how rulers rise when others sleep, how fear moves crowds faster than truth, how every revolution begins not with courage, but with someone feeling ignored. These weren't theories. These were facts dressed in flesh, and once you see them, you cannot unsee them. That's why Machiavelli remained dangerous, even in exile. He didn't need armies. He had understanding. Most men who suffer want revenge. He wanted insight, and insight makes you untouchable. Because once you understand the system, you no longer need to beg for a place in it. You can manipulate it. You can reshape it. You can survive without it. The mind that studies is never truly broken. Because while the body suffers, the mind stores. And what it stores, it can use later. That is what Machiavelli was building: an arsenal. Every memory repurposed, every scar catalogued, not as tragedy, as leverage. That's the shift most never make. They tell their story to be pitied. He told his to be prepared. They beg for justice. He builds his next move. And the less he worried about how others saw him, the more clearly he saw the world. Emotion fogs the lens, but detachment sharpens it. And once it's sharp, everything becomes obvious. Who will betray? Who will fold? Who will rise too fast and fall harder? He saw it all before it happened, because he had seen it before. History does not repeat by accident. It repeats because most people feel too much to think. And Machiavelli flipped the script. He thought too much to feel, not because he lacked heart, but because he knew one thing with certainty. The man who drowns in emotion becomes part of the pattern. The man who observes it rewrites it. They plotted in whispers. Behind doors he was no longer allowed to enter. Letters were exchanged. Hands were shaken. Threats disguised as courtesies passed between men who once called him friend. Machiavelli knew the feeling. The slow tightening of a noose you can't see but feel. Most men panic when they sense it. They speak too loudly, defend too early, betray themselves trying to prevent betrayal. But Machiavelli did not. He understood something deeper. When they plot your downfall, you must not interrupt them. You must let them believe you are blind. Let them believe you are broken. Let them believe you pose no threat. Because when your enemies think you are done, they stop being careful. They expose themselves. And that is when the game begins. Fear turns most people into actors. They perform their strength louder when they feel weaker. But not him. He lowered his voice. He let the rumors grow. He disappeared from the scenes they expected him to crash. And while they imagined him helpless, he was preparing. Because stillness is not surrender, it is strategy. The man who reacts gives his enemy a mirror, but the man who stays calm builds an invisible wall. You cannot hit what you cannot read. That was Machiavelli's gift, his refusal to flinch. Even as the world turned its back, even as the knives moved closer, he never gave them what they wanted. They wanted to see desperation. He gave them silence. They wanted to see movement. He gave them stillness. They wanted a war. He gave them a study, and in that quiet he watched their patterns unfold. Because panic distorts, but calm decodes. And when your mind is still, you begin to hear the subtle things: who hesitates, who overcompensates, who repeats the same lie with a new smile. These are not just observations, these are weapons. And the man who holds them does not need to speak loudly. He only needs to wait. Machiavelli never tried to stop betrayal. He let it happen, and in doing so he learned how to outlive it. That's what they never understood. You cannot destroy a man who does not need to be seen. You cannot trap a man who walks willingly into exile. And you cannot defeat a man who does not fear isolation, because that man will return not for revenge, but for power. And power gained in silence lasts longer than any scream. So when they plotted, he didn't panic. He sharpened his understanding. He studied their movements, the way a hunter studies the forest, never rushing, never revealing, just watching. And when the moment came, he would strike with something colder than rage certainty. Because the storm doesn't destroy the man who builds his shelter in advance, it reveals him. And Machiavelli was already waiting. There is a strange kind of power in saying nothing, in holding your tongue while others bleed from their mouths. Most people cannot do it. The silence makes them squirm. They feel the need to explain, to defend, to fill the space with noise that reassures others they are still in control. But Machiavelli knew the opposite was true. The man who says less sees more, because every word you offer becomes a thread to pull, a weapon to twist, a door into your mind. And once your thoughts are accessible, you are no longer dangerous, you are predictable. That is how men lose power without ever realizing it. They reveal themselves too soon. They confess their fears by how quickly they speak. They disclose their strategy by trying to sound wise. But the quiet man, the one who waits, listens, and speaks only when movement is required, that man becomes unreadable, and the unreadable man is untouchable. Machiavelli built this discipline like a fortress. He trained his mind to be still before his mouth opened. He learned to ask questions instead of offering answers. He watched how people responded to silence, how they rushed to fill it, how they exposed their motives without realizing it. Every pause became an interrogation, every delay a mirror. And while others searched for something to say, he was collecting data. Because in conversation, weakness leaks. A single word can betray intent. A single explanation can undo months of control. The need to be understood, to be liked, to be seen clearly, That is what drags most men into the mud. But Machiavelli buried that need early. He realized that clarity is overrated. Mystery, on the other hand, is magnetic. The less people know about your intentions, the more they imagine. And what they imagine will often serve you better than the truth ever could. He became a master of the half-answer, the polite deflection, the raised brow with no follow-up. These are not tricks, these are tools, and tools build empires. The ruler who says less controls more, because words once spoken cannot be retrieved. But silence expands. It creates discomfort, and in that discomfort people show their hands. They speak too much, they promise too fast, they reveal too soon, and by the time they realize what they've done, it's already in your hands. That's why Machiavelli never rushed to correct the record. Let them misunderstand. Let them fill the gaps with their own projections. He didn't need to win arguments, he needed to win control. And control is never loud. It is built in the quiet moments, when everyone else is performing and you are simply watching. Because the man who speaks less doesn't lose influence, he multiplies it. Quietly, precisely, irrevocably. There is a moment, always, when they expect you to break. A pause in the conversation, a sudden silence in the room, a glance they throw at you just to see if you'll flinch. They want to see the pain in your eyes. They want to see that what they did affected you. And when you don't give them that, when you stay still, unfazed, unmoved, they don't feel victorious. They feel confused. That was Machiavelli's weapon. Not rage, not retaliation, but indifference, or at least the illusion of it. He knew that pretending not to care dismantles more power than shouting ever could. Because when you show no reaction, people lose the script. They don't know whether they've won, or if you're simply waiting for a better time to strike, and that uncertainty becomes fear. He didn't use anger, he used calm. He didn't chase apologies, he moved on without explanation. The more they tried to provoke him, the more still he became. That's what rattled them. It wasn't that he didn't feel, it was that he chose not to show it, and that choice made him dangerous. Because the man who controls his expression controls the conversation. He rewrote the rules of engagement. While others screamed for justice, he studied what justice cost. While others demanded closure, he calculated what opening it would leave behind. This isn't apathy, it's dominance. Because when you perform indifference, you stop giving them control over your emotions. You stop feeding their need to be needed. You stop explaining yourself to people who only listen to twist your words. And you begin to operate in silence, on your own terms, in your own time. Most people underestimate the power of emotional distance. They think caring is strength. But Machiavelli understood that caring too much, too openly, is a weakness. It ties your worth to how others respond to you. It makes you dependent, predictable, and those who are predictable are always exploited first. But the man who doesn't react, who doesn't chase, who doesn't beg, he becomes a mystery. And in power, mystery is leverage. Let them wonder what you're thinking. Let them feel the weight of your silence. Let them obsess over why you walked away without a word. That obsession will cost them more sleep than your rage ever could. Machiavelli knew that the world expects emotion. They feed on it. They manipulate it. But when you offer none, they starve. And in that starvation you rise. Not as a martyr, not as a victim, but as a man who chose what to feel, when to feel, and most importantly what to hide. They don't need to destroy you to control you. They only need to make you feel. That's what Machiavelli understood. Emotion is not weakness by itself, it is vulnerability in disguise. It is a leash you wear without noticing. Because once someone knows how to make you react, they no longer need to command you. They just pull the right string, a glance, a silence, a word said in just the right tone. And suddenly your whole mind tilts off balance. You justify your anger. You defend your name. You argue a point that doesn't matter just because they made you feel attacked. And while you're busy proving yourself, you don't notice what they've taken from you. Your position, your composure, your edge. Machiavelli saw this happen every day. Men of title and status undone not by armies but by emotion. A ruler who needs to be loved will bend too far. A general who needs to be understood will hesitate when he should strike. A leader who needs to be right will waste time correcting instead of commanding. That's why Machiavelli warned, never lead from emotion, or you will be led by others. The moment you explain yourself, the moment you plead, the moment you chase approval, you surrender ground, even if you are right, even if they are wrong, because the real game isn't about truth, it's about control. And control goes to the one who stays cold. That doesn't mean heartless, it means intentional, detached enough to see the trap before you walk into it. Most people don't see it. They mistake their reactions for righteousness. They think emotion makes them real, makes them human. But to Machiavelli, a man ruled by his emotions was never fully his own. He was a puppet with 100 masters, each one pulling a different thread. Guilt, shame, pride, approval, envy, and with every tug, he loses more of himself. That's why silence isn't just strength, it's protection. That's why calm isn't just control, it's defense. Because when your enemies try to bait you and you offer nothing, they reveal themselves instead. When they insult you and you stay still, they begin to wonder if you've already won. And when they try again and again and still get no reaction, they begin to crumble, not you. The world is full of people begging to be understood. Machiavelli chose to be unreadable. The world is full of men trying to win with emotion. He chose to win with silence. Because in the end, it's not the loudest who holds power. It's the one who cannot be moved. Not by words, not by threats, not even by praise. That man cannot be led. He leads. They called him ruthless, cold, manipulative. They turned his name into a warning, twisted his words into weapons, and painted him as the architect of cruelty. And still, he never corrected them. Machiavelli allowed the world to misunderstand him, not out of weakness, but out of strategy. Because once you learn the value of being misread, you stop trying to be understood. You begin to use confusion as a cloak. That was his genius. While others fought to explain themselves, to clear their names, to make their intentions pure, he vanished into ambiguity, and in that space he operated freely. Misunderstanding gives you freedom. It creates a version of you that people attack, while the real version moves undetected. They strike at the ghost, not the hand. They argue with the myth, while you shape reality. That's what Machiavelli mastered. He didn't just survive being hated, he used it. Because hatred has a pattern. It makes people predictable. They expect you to retaliate, to justify, to grovel for a second chance. But when you don't, when you let them build their version of you and walk away from it, you gain the one advantage no one sees coming: invisibility. And from invisibility, you can see everything. Most people are obsessed with being known. They want their story told accurately, their pain recognized, their image polished. But that need becomes a prison. The more they correct the narrative, the more they live inside it. Machiavelli chose the opposite. He let the lie live. He fed it, even. Because while people were focused on who they thought he was, they ignored what he was actually doing. That is power. To not just endure being misunderstood, but to make it your shield. The man who is always explaining himself will always be at the mercy of those who refuse to listen. But the man who accepts distortion becomes unpredictable. You cannot cage what you do not understand. You cannot manipulate what you cannot define. And you cannot destroy a man who has already let go of being liked. Machiavelli's name became infamous, but his influence never faded. Because history remembered the myth, but the world adopted the method. That was the trade. Reputation for relevance, recognition for reach. And in that trade, he won. You do not need to be seen clearly to be effective. You do not need applause to make impact. Sometimes, The most dangerous mind in the room is the one you misunderstood. And by the time you realize who he really was, he's already moved on, already 5 moves ahead, already watching you cling to the wrong version. That is the brilliance of being misread. It gives you room, and in that room, you do not explain, you build, quietly, permanently, without mercy. They don't need to kill you to win. They only need to provoke you. That was the truth Machiavelli saw more clearly than anyone. Power is not taken all at once. It is chipped away every time you react. Every time you flinch. Every time you defend yourself when silence would have been enough. Your reaction becomes the opening. And once they learn how to pull it from you, they don't have to fight you directly. They let you destroy yourself. Machiavelli knew that the first attack is never the real one. The first attack is a question. Will you respond? If you do, the enemy learns everything they need. They learn what gets under your skin, what you feel insecure about, what you'll abandon your dignity to defend. Most men fail that test. They give it all away in the name of proving themselves. But Machiavelli passed it, not with pride, with stillness. He watched as insults came and went, as lies spread, as alliances turned to threats, and he gave them nothing. No anger, no clarification, no trace of vulnerability. Because when you don't react, the enemy has to guess, and guessing leads to mistakes. He once said that princes must appear virtuous, but act according to necessity. The same applies to the mind. You must appear calm, but inside that calm must live calculation. You must become a man who never moves first, never blinks first, never speaks before the field has revealed its shape. That restraint is rare, because reaction feels powerful, but it is not. It is instinct, not strategy. And instinct, when manipulated, becomes your leash. They pull, and you come running. They poke, and you roar. They vanish, and you chase. That is not strength. That is slavery with better clothing. Machiavelli understood that the one who reacts is always playing someone else's game. That's why he stayed quiet when they accused him. Why he didn't show outrage when they locked him out of the palace. He knew the real war was not fought with words, but with timing. The man who waits owns the outcome. Because while his enemies are burning energy, trying to provoke, trying to control the tempo, he is conserving it, watching, mapping, preparing for the moment they expose themselves by pushing too hard. And when that moment comes, he does not react. He responds with precision, with silence that cuts deeper than any reply. That is the essence of control, not needing to respond to everything, not needing to correct every lie, not needing to be seen fighting back, because the moment you need to prove your strength, you have already given it away. Machiavelli never did. And that is why, no matter how many times they came for him, they never truly touched him. They only touched the version they created. The real man stayed untouchable, hidden behind a mind that refused to react. They expected rage, they expected screaming, they expected collapse. But when they turned on him, Machiavelli gave them none of it. He smiled, or worse, he said nothing at all. That silence did more damage than 1,000 threats. Because people are prepared for anger, they know how to respond to it, how to justify their actions against it. But calm, true, unshaken calm, that unsettles them. It makes them question if they ever had power over you at all. Machiavelli understood that fear is not created through noise. It is created through control. And the greatest control is emotional detachment. While the world spirals, the man who does not tremble becomes a mirror. And when others see their hysteria reflected against your stillness, they lose confidence in themselves. That is how dominance is built, not through aggression, but through contrast. The man who stays calm forces the world to reveal itself. When accusations come and he does not respond, the accuser is left alone with his own echo. When betrayal happens and there is no retaliation, the traitor begins to doubt his victory. It's the absence of expected emotion that does the damage. Because calm is not emptiness, it is pressure. And the longer you hold it, the more the people around you begin to crack. Machiavelli knew this. He wrote that it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. But he also knew that real fear is not loud. It's quiet. It sits across the room and watches you unravel. It does not need to raise its voice because it never lowered itself in the first place. He learned this by observing courts and kings, generals and traitors. Those who led with fury burned out. Those who ruled with silence endured. He understood that emotional chaos is predictable. It becomes a pattern. But calm is disorienting. It cannot be planned against. And most people cannot replicate it because they are ruled by their feelings. But Machiavelli stripped those away not because he lacked them, but because he refused to be controlled by them. And in that refusal, he became something the world wasn't ready for, ungovernable. That's what truly terrifies others. Not your strength, not your intellect, but your refusal to be shaken, your refusal to respond, your refusal to play the part they wrote for you. People can conquer rage, they can reason with pain, but they do not know what to do with a man who simply refuses to bend. And that's what made Machiavelli so dangerous. Not his politics, not his philosophy, but the fact that you could not rattle him. He had already mastered the one thing that makes men truly powerful, not control over others, but control over himself. They never understood how he survived, how a man stripped of power, mocked by nobles, tortured by his own city, could walk back into history like nothing had touched him. But that was the secret. Power had never left him because it had never been outside him. Machiavelli didn't rely on title. He didn't need an army. He didn't chase reputation or demand loyalty. He built something no enemy could take. A mind that did not flinch, a center that did not shift, a silence that did not break. While others ruled with crowns and steel, he ruled with perception. He saw what moved men, what softened them, what made them weak, even as they shouted from thrones. And every time he was cast aside, he grew sharper, quieter, more exact. The world teaches us to chase strength, to project it, display it. But Machiavelli showed us something deeper, that the strongest man is not the one who commands the room. It is the one who remains unshaken when the room turns on him. He doesn't panic. He doesn't plead. He watches. He endures. And when the time is right, he moves not with desperation, but with precision. That is real sovereignty. The ability to remain intact when everything around you breaks. The refusal to be broken by betrayal, exile, silence, loss. The ability to walk through humiliation without lowering your head. He once wrote that fortune is a river, wild and flooding. But what he didn't say outright was this: you don't stop the river. You build high ground. You rise above it. That is what his mind became. High ground. The storms came. They always do. But he stood still. And in that stillness, he saw clearly what others missed in their fear. Where to stand, when to act, who to trust, who to let destroy themselves. And because he never allowed worry to shape his decisions, he shaped outcomes no one else could see coming. That's what you must take from him. Not the coldness, not the manipulation, but the clarity, the sovereignty, the ability to remain yours even when the world pushes for a reaction, because once you learn to control your mind, no one else can. Not a king, not a mob, not your enemies, not your fears. That is what Machiavelli left behind, not just a book, not just a name, but a blueprint for those bold enough to walk alone, calm enough to wait, cold enough to see clearly. The world will always try to shake you, but remember this: the less you worry, the more you win. If this moved you, share it. If it exposed something, sit with it. And if it changed you, stay quiet about it. Let them feel it instead. Subscribe for more dark truths they hope you never learn.